founding of the Loyola Club. Now, most of us have Jesuit connections, either as a graduate of a Jesuit school or maybe a member of a parish where the Jesuits are, or connections
about the intros. So there is an introductory video. Yeah, oh, there's not.
And we know that people are looking for this connection to Nation spirituality. And this concept of Loyola Club has been growing across the states. In fact, one of our newest Loyola Club is Traverse City. This is Father Jeremy Zippel. Thank you. In fact, Traverse City, Michigan has a summer event. There's a flyer out at the table. And I also wanted to recognize my counterpart, Marty West, who's the chair of Detroit's Loyola Club this year. He was able to join us. This is the 9th year, and yet we're still not widely known, so please spread the word. There's no special initiation. It's pretty easy to become a member. You just show up for lunch. And I also want to take a moment and just thank our table sponsors that are listed in the program. As you know, the Loyola Club is really a volunteer organization, and your support means so much and lets us do this important programming. And I invite everyone else in the room to consider purchasing a table at our next event, which will be in October, with a speaker soon to be named. It's an excellent way to connect and network with people who share our Jesuit values. Also at your places, you have a postcard for WUJA, the World Union of Jesuit Alumni. WUJA is holding a congress here next summer. The World Union of Jesuit Alumni, or WUJA, was founded 50 years ago in 1956, and they hold this idea of an international congress every 4 years, gathering Jesuit friends and alums from around the world. Sometimes as many as 50 different countries could be represented. From June 28th to July 2nd, June 28th to July 2nd, 5 days next summer, WUJA will meet for the first time ever in the United States, in North America, at John Carroll University. We're very proud to be hosting it. They will be gathering yes, applause, that's a big good. On the back of your program, you already see some of the speakers who have been identified. And the theme of the Congress is to know God, to love God, and to serve God. On each of the 3 full days, that theme will be present. Attendees, which are made up of alumni and friends of Jesuit institutions, will have a lot of opportunities to connect, learn, to celebrate, and it will provide a unique platform for people to take shared experiences back to their countries. And I know how hospitable we're going to be this summer with the RNC, so I think the WUJA will be a lot easier. More information is available online, but I really encourage you to consider it, to attend yourself or to be a sponsor. I know we're always looking for sponsorships. And it's now my pleasure to invite Rita Carfagna to the podium to introduce our featured speaker. Rita herself is the outgoing chair of the Jesuit Treat House. She was an important pioneer in the early days of the spirituality program for adults at St. Ignatius High School and is a board member at America Media. And we thank Rita in particular for helping us corral our speaker for today. Please welcome Rita.
It is my distinct privilege to introduce Father Matt Malone to you today. But before I do so, I wanted to take a moment to introduce the man behind the camera and all things technical today. And he won't even look at us because he's busy. Father Jeremy Zippel. Father Zippel, he's waving, is an incredibly talented, award-winning documentary filmmaker and former producer for National Geographic, who now serves as the executive editor of America Films. He also happens to be a proud graduate of Boston College, where he found his vocation. Welcome, Jeremy. Father Matt Malone is the president and editor-in-chief of America Media, the publisher of America, the national weekly Jesuit magazine, which has been in continuous publication since 1909, well over 100 years. In the 3.5 short years since Matt began his tenure as the youngest editor-in-chief in America's history, he and his all-star staff have transformed America from a weekly publication with a simple website into a dynamic 21st century multi-platform media ministry. In addition to its award-winning magazine, America Media's platforms include its digital content, its website, blogs, videos, many created by Father Zippel, podcasts, slideshows, and vigorous social media presence. Its other platforms are books, events and programming, a weekly radio show on Sirius Satellite Radio's Catholic channel, films, and its online ministry, the Jesuit Post. But Father Malone will tell you all about that in a moment. As for the man at the helm, you will see from Father Malone's bio in your program that he entered the Society of Jesus in 2002 and was ordained a priest in 2012 by Edward Cardinal Egan. He has received degrees from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Fordham University, the University of London, and the Catholic University of Louvain. Father Malone's extensive experience as a writer spans over 20 years, focusing particularly in the arenas of foreign policy and domestic politics. His works have been featured in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post, among others. Many of you might have seen Father Malone on PBS and other channels during Pope Francis's visit to the United States this past September. As Mary Ann mentioned, I've had the honor of serving on the America Media Board for the past 4 years. And last year, my husband Peter and I were blessed to go on the pilgrimage to the Holy Land that America sponsors, which Father Malone led as one of our chaplains, along with Father Zippel and Father Jim Martin. Just an aside, if you have the ability to do so, I encourage any of you to make this pilgrimage. It was an unforgettable and life-changing experience. America also sponsors an Ignatian pilgrimage to Spain. So I've had the privilege of getting to know Matt and witnessing his inspired leadership in action. Father Malone is a brilliant and bold leader who is at the same time a humble team player. He is a man of deep faith and an excellent homilist who clearly loves his priesthood. I've always appreciated how he keeps the reader and the staff centered on Christ, no matter the material and topics of the week. He sets this tone through his thoughtful and well-written weekly column of Many Things. Additionally, in this era of partisan politics, when that partisanship can creep so quickly into our Catholic conversation, I especially appreciate Father Malone's commitment to peaceful and inclusive dialogue. He has pursued this by adding contributing editors representing every point of view along the Catholic Christian spectrum, and by making an effort to eliminate from America's content language that can be categorizing and divisive, words like progressive, liberal, and conservative. We live in a world that at times appears to be so desperately broken, but at the same time wonderfully shot through with beauty, love, and joy, as Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry reminds us. I think all of us, whether we know it or not, are constantly seeking God in the midst of it and how God is guiding us through it. We're trying to find God in all things, as Ignatius taught us to do. American media helps us do that by informing our journeys in light of our Catholic faith. The Jesuits and we are blessed to have Father Matt Malone leading that effort, and we are very fortunate to have him with us here today. Matt.
Thank you very much, Rita, for that extremely generous introduction. And we are indeed blessed at America to have the support of you and Peter. It is no easy thing to transform a 106-year-old organization from a weekly print magazine to a multimedia ministry. And we couldn't do it without the support of our board of directors and the leadership and generosity of people like Rita and Peter. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank the Loyola Club for inviting me here today. I feel as if I and myself am standing on the shoulders of giants when I saw the lineup of people who have already addressed you, and I hope to be worthy of the effort. I should say that, this is my first trip to Cleveland, and it is really great to be here. And I note that immediately after my arrival, the Cavs won, and the Tribe won, and the Captains won. So you ought to have me more often. The other reason why it's such a great thing to be with you today is because in just a few months, this city and this state will, in large measure, determine the outcome of the presidential election. And today I would like to talk to you a bit about how it is that we might approach this political experience as Catholics, and how America, the magazine, that is, the media ministry, looks at this moment in the life of the church and in the life of this country. America Magazine is really the product of the vision of two men. The first was a saint and a genius, and the second, while a genius, was hardly a saint. We are indebted, first of all, to the vision of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And if you're familiar with Ignatian spirituality, as I know so many of you are, then you will know a fundamental Ignatian principle, one that he mentions in the spiritual exercises. God meets us where we are. For St. Ignatius, that principle obviously meant that Jesuits should do the same, meet people where they are. And Ignatius's time, the mid-16th century, that meant moving downtown to the very center of the eternal city of Rome. And that Ignatian impulse to be at the center of activity, at the center of action, is the spirit in which America Magazine was conceived by Father John Wynne in 1909. And yes, America is located downtown, or as it is known in New York City, in Midtown, but that is not the most relevant bit of our geography. For what Father Wynne understood was that in the United States, that new and daring experiment in civil society, the city that mattered most was an intellectual municipality, the arena in which ideas are exchanged, what a later generation would call the public square. And so America set up shop, as it were, overlooking the public square, right at the corner of the church and the world. And the object was threefold: to assist with the faith formation of American Catholics, the evangelization of American culture, and the progress of America's civil society. Thus, our name. Father Wynne had the genius to found the magazine, but not the skill to manage it. He burned through $300,000 in 1909. And so he was replaced in a year by a less bombastic Jesuit. But the mission that he bequeathed to America is our mission today: to chronicle the events of the day and the progress of the church, and to stimulate effort and originate movements for the betterment of the masses. That is our mission, and it remains constant, but we face unique challenges. It is no secret that the vanguard of the digital revolution has toppled the Ancien regime. 1 billion tweets, for example, are sent in the 5 days it takes us to process and print a single issue of the magazine. More than 10 billion pieces of content are added to Facebook in that same period. At the time that Father Wynne and his colleagues set up America in a townhouse in Washington Square, the first transcontinental telephone call was still 6 years away. Yet today, my youngest niece does not know what a dial tone is. And Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report, which were once rightly regarded as the Ford and Chrysler of news magazines, are beyond recognition today. Now, America, I am reasonably confident, will not meet a similar fate. Like most magazines, we will probably stop printing an edition someday, but not anytime soon. For a variety of reasons, America is better positioned than most to meet the challenges of the digital age, and we also happen to have an amazingly talented staff and the most loyal readers in publishing. But our ultimate concern is not so mundane. For from our window overlooking the public square, we see many of the same things that you see. And chief among them, we see a body politic that is sickened by the toxin of ideological partisanship. And by ideological partisanship, I do not mean, of course, spirited disagreement and debate, because in every country and in every culture, there will be contestable social and political issues. And in a democracy, such issues ought to be contested vigorously. Civilization, wrote the Dominican Thomas Gilby, is formed by men locked together in argument. Rather, by ideological partisanship, I refer to systems of thought, those concrete isms that actually inhibit and frequently destroy meaningful and productive argument. And that is because an ideology, regardless of whether it originates on the left or the right, regardless of whether it is draped in religious or secular sentiment, it is a self-referential, utterly this-worldly meta-narrative. A doctrine that presents the hidden and saving truths about the evils of the world in the form of a circular social analysis. In other words, an ideology is a question that answers itself. And it lends itself to idolatry, precisely because it is seemingly omniscient by virtue of this circular explanatory power. An ideology is impervious to facts, a phenomenon we are currently experiencing in spades in our presidential politics. And it should be clear that a society whose debate is structured by ideology is essentially incapable of argument in the truest sense of the term. For Christians, ideologies are particularly dangerous, for they turn the church in on itself. And Pope Francis has warned us of this phenomenon. He has said, when the faith passes, so to speak, through a distiller and becomes ideology, it becomes dangerous. For ideology, says the Pope, does not beckon people. In ideologies, there is not Jesus, in his tenderness, in his meekness. And ideologies are rigid, always, of every sign rigid, says the Pope. And when a Christian becomes a disciple of an ideology, he has lost the faith, for he is no longer a disciple of Jesus, but a disciple of this attitude of thought. It will not be news to you that the political discourse in the contemporary United States is rife with ideological partisanship and the divisions it sows. A 2015 Emory University study found that since 1992, and especially since 2008, partisan identities have become increasingly associated with racial, cultural, and ideological divisions in American society. Now, a thorough analysis of the cause of this phenomenon is not my task here today, but I think it is worth noting that the ideological partisanship that characterizes our national debate has been facilitated and accelerated in part by the forces of secularism, by the use of social media as a news source, and by the proliferation of 24-hour news channels. Now, in the first instance, it is clear that we inhabit what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls a secular age. And a secular age is characterized by the widespread rejection of the beyond. It is a time in which the eclipse of all goals beyond human flourishing becomes conceivable. And this eclipse is accompanied by a widespread belief in what he calls self-sufficient humanism. This notion that there are no goals beyond human flourishing, nor any allegiance to anything else beyond human flourishing. Now, the political implications of Dr. Taylor's thesis are obvious. If there are no goals beyond human flourishing, no shared acknowledgement of something beyond this life, then what fundamentally concerns only this life becomes all the more important, and politics, therefore, becomes liturgy. And more importantly, in a secular society, ideology displaces theology, just as the polis displaces the church as the center of community and the instrument of its unity. In a secular age, instead of the patient grace of God, the state is what transforms the secular many into a one. And politicians, therefore, become ever more powerful and priestly symbols. And the political stakes are high, for we no longer live in a fallen world, but in an imperfect society. And our debate becomes about the best means of self-perfection, a goal that is equally cynical and tragic. And the proposed means of our self-perfection takes the form of ideology. Yet, as the theologian James Henry recently wrote in America, a society that has substituted arguments about means for arguments about ends is a society that is in decline. And this phenomenon of ideological partisanship is also driven by an increase in the use of social media as a primary news source. Platforms that use algorithms to determine the likes of their users and then deliver similar content. According to a 2014 Princeton University study, the result is that while it is virtually impossible to not encounter some contrary ideological views in social media, those with the most consistent ideological views on the left and the right, those most active in the public dialogue, have information streams that are distinct from those individuals with more mixed political views, and very distinct from each other. In other words, as much as it can be a force for good, social media also exacerbates existing ideological and partisan divisions by confirming only those viewpoints with which we already agree. And the secular press is also complicit in this rise of ideological partisanship. There was a day when both Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater, two people who vigorously disagreed with each other, they both watched Walter Cronkite. They both trusted him. We all did. Now, broadcast journalism in our country, in addition to its more noble pursuits, exists to create mass markets for advertisers. And back in the day when there were only 3 networks, it was the sheer size of the market that mattered most. But with the proliferation of news channels, not to mention online news sources, the goal is no longer to bring together demographics to create an audience, but to sever them from each other and to say, we own that demographic. It is often a narrow, demographically homogeneous audience, but it just so happens to be the audience that buys widgets. These are the causes, among others, of the present crisis in our public discourse. Ideological partisanship is a threat to the health of our democracy, for it renders argument, which is the distinguishing feature of civilization, virtually impossible. But ideological partisanship is a mortal threat to the church, for it reduces the one, the church, to the many, its factions. And what I mean is that when we conceive of the church in predominantly secular or political terms, then it ceases in principle to be the church. It is no longer a polis, it is no longer a communion, but a polis composed of factions. And as a result, the terms and the tenor of our ecclesiastical conversation are increasingly indistinguishable from those of the larger secular culture. And the Catholic press begins to look like the nightly cable lineup. As Pope Francis has said, then faith becomes ideology, and ideology frightens. Ideology chases away the people, distances the people, and distances the church from the people. But it is a serious illness, the Pope called the ideologies of Christians. Now, allow me to share an example of this phenomenon. Not long ago, I was attending a theology class in London in which a theology professor posed a rather straightforward question. Who could tell me the title of the chapter in Lumen Gentium that talks about the laity, the Vatican II document called Lumen Gentium? And that's an easy one, we all thought. And a half dozen hands shut up. We said, the people of God. That's the chapter that talks about the laity. And the professor, in his Jesuitical way, said, "Wrong." The chapter about the lady, he said, is titled "The Lady." So the chapter titled "The People of God" includes the lady, but the people of God means all the members of the church, clerical and lay alike. And that was news to a lot of us, for we had been told that the most important teaching of Vatican II was that the church is the people of God, which meant the church is the lady and not the hierarchy. But our professor had a point. If there's a chapter titled "The People of God" and also a chapter titled "The Lady," it follows that they are not, strictly speaking, the same thing. But you would not know that from listening to our ecclesial conversation at times. For not a few of us were saying something like this during the last papal conclave: "What we need is a pope who will remember that the church is the people of God and not the priests and the bishops." But not only is that not what the conciliar fathers meant by the phrase "people of God," it is precisely the opposite. The council never understood the phrase "people of God" to mean of this worldly political class, let alone some kind of lay proletariat engaged in some kind of political struggle with a clerical bourgeoisie. Because conceived in those purely political terms, the phrase is just a blunt expression of power politics. It's nothing more than the latest version of the disciples' argument about who was the greatest among them. The phrase "people of God" in that sense is not essentially different from clericalism, which also makes claims about who is the greatest. Still, the council did do something different. It reminded us that the church is more than the ministerial priesthood. It's a hierarchy of all the baptized. And that teaching surely has political implications, but its spiritual significance is far more important. We are reminded in the dogmatic constitution on the Church of Vatican II that the expression "people of God" is a summons to unity. It is a symbol of the one body of Christ. It is not the "we the people" of our secular politics. And I see this play out in the mail we get at America. We're lucky. Our readers are smart, and they're generous, and they are kind, and their feedback is always welcome and always helpful. It's also mainly positive. But still, a week doesn't go by when we don't receive a complaint about something we've published. And we don't mind criticism. In fact, it is often justified. But one type of response is neither helpful nor justified. From time to time, someone will contact us to say something like, "How could you publish so-and-so? Don't you know that he, she is," and you can take your pick here, "a liberal conservative and or a restorationist/heretic?" The person writing, in other words, objects not to the author's opinion per se, but to the author's mere presence in our pages. And that kind of response, lacking in charity and closed in on itself, is a sure sign that an ideology is at work. It helps to explain why some Christians feel so threatened by opinions that differ from their own, even when those opinions involve matters of judgment rather than dogma. But the truth of our faith is not ultimately propositional. It is personal. For Christians, truth is not ultimately an idea, but a person whose name is Jesus Christ, the way and the truth and the life. Does it not follow, then, that a living Christian faith should include an open and generous intellectual disposition? Now, America would never publish a manuscript that is manifestly unorthodox or heretical or uncivil or patently false or just plain unintelligible. But the truth of the matter is we don't receive many of those. Our authors may disagree, sometimes vigorously, but they represent positions within the broad spectrum of mainstream Catholic opinion. We can, as Catholic Christians, have spirited differences with one another, and our secular politics can account for some of them. But the Council Fathers did not call us to mount the barricades. They called us to holiness. Yet due to the influence of ideological partisanship, The current ecclesial discourse is not different enough from the secular discourse. The same kind of partisan breakdowns, the same kind of cliques, and even occasionally the same kind of invective can prevail in both. Yet if our vision for the church to come is to avoid fatal distortions, we must leave these ideologies behind. If we are to be the one holy people of God, then we must stop claiming that we possess the truth, as false prophets and ideologues always do, and start praying that he possesses us. When Pope Francis announced that John Paul II and John the 23rd would be canonized together on the same day, the phone started ringing in America, and they were looking for commentary on this event. And one of the reporters from a very well-known national newspaper said to me, "Father, would you call this a bipartisan canonization?" Is Francis telling us that Catholics need to reach across the aisle? And I said, no, that's not quite right, even by analogy. I said, this event isn't about what we should do, it's about what God has already done. And the reporter said, well, I can't really print that. And now, in fairness, I get that. For when it comes to the church and the secular media, we often have unreasonable expectations. For in asking them to report accurately on what is in reality a living mystery, we are asking them to do more than they are really trained to do. But I have less patience when it is a fellow Catholic who is telling the story and getting it wrong. And I've seen a bit of that. For not a few people have told me that they think it was politically ingenious of Pope Francis to canonize these men on the same day, bringing together these two very different people. Not a few people have said to me, I think it's great that there's finally a pope who agrees with me. Or I think it's great that there's finally a pope who's challenging them. But except for the obvious differences in nationality and philosophical tastes and all the rest between these two Johns, John Paul and John the 23rd, I fail to discern a truly meaningful difference between them. And that's a good thing, because what we celebrated in their sainthood is what they have in common. Their canonization was not about us and our narcissistic politicking. It was about what God had accomplished in the lives of these two great men of the church. And Pope Francis's intention in canonizing them together had less to do with how you and I should relate to one another and much more to do with how you and I relate to God. In other words, the joint canonization of John Paul II and John the 23rd reminded us that the goal of Christian living is not to be right, but to be holy. And the way to holiness is to allow ourselves to be possessed by the truth. And these two Johns were possessed by the one who is truth. Yet their lives also point the way in the here and now. For each of them testified in his own dramatic way to the fact that if the key to holiness is the gift of ourselves to Christ, the one who is truth, then the key to human action is the gift of the self to others, those who are similarly made in the image and likeness of God, the God of Jesus Christ, the one for whom love and mercy and justice are the only standards of human action. And in an increasingly impersonal and depersonalized world, one ravaged by ideological as well as literal warfare, this self-gift to God and this gift of ourselves to one another, if it is truly grace-filled, will more and more resemble the radical acts of love and forgiveness to which the gospel testifies, acts of discipleship that are subversive of every human notion of power, acts of generosity and generativity that never proceed from ideological designs. Such were the virtues of John and John Paul, and we could use more of them. For if we are to avoid further divisions, if we are to overcome this challenge of the church and the political, then we must proceed in a penitential key. from our own powerlessness, from a lived acknowledgement of the sheer gratuity of our creation and our redemption. For this was the narrow gate through which these two Johns once passed. And in a similar way, if the Catholic press are to make a meaningful contribution to solving the problem of the church and the polis, then we must first reckon with how we have been complicit in the subtle secularization of the church through the import of ideological partisanship into our ecclesial life. And America is no exception. We too must return to the question, who are we? And our answer to that question is shaped in no small measure by the work of John Courtney Murray, S.J., the 20th century Jesuit theologian. Father Murray was a friend and an associate editor and a contributor to America for more than 20 years, and in almost 24 articles he explored the relationship of Catholicism and American public life, seeking to answer the question, are they ultimately compatible? And his answer was yes. And that is our answer too. But contemporary critiques of Father Murray also inform our thinking, and they suggest that Murray's answer to the compatibility question was not necessarily wrong, but that the question itself is unanswerable, at least at the level at which Father Murray pursued it. For an answer at that macro level requires so many levels of abstraction that the result is often an unwieldy historical and philosophical or theological structure that can't support itself. And it's almost certain, moreover, that the answer to this compatibility question, even in its most general form, is neither yes nor no, but somehow both. So the current state of Father Murray's question calls for a new method of questioning, one that is narrower than Father Murray's, for it concerns practice, not dogma, and experience, not ideology. Which aspects of American life are compatible with Christian faith, and which are not? And more important, is this particular historical event or choice justified in light of our Christian faith? Is the conduct of this institution, or the impact of that public policy, or the moral character of that market force compatible with the principles of Catholic faith? Our contemporary questions should be concerned with the lived experience of Americans. Yet ultimately, this compatibility question is not an intellectual exercise at all. It's simply the work of Christian discipleship. For the things that we love, Thomas Aquinas reminded us, tell us what we are. So whom do we love? Who or what, practically speaking, in real life, are the gods that we worship? For what and for whom are we willing to die? Do we really live each day in the hope of heaven? As William T. Kavanaugh has asked, what would our country really look like after we have rendered unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's? What belongs to the city of man and what to the city of God? Father Thurston Davis, who was America's editor-in-chief from 1955 to 1968, once described America as a weekly raid on the city of God in order to publish in the city of man a journal that talks common Christian sense about the world of human events. And that was much on my mind as I traveled between two other cities last year, New York and Kansas City, in order to attend two very different events. In New York, I attended the annual Erasmus Lecture given by Archbishop Charles Chaput of Philadelphia and hosted by First Things, a journal of opinion founded by the late Reverend Richard John Newhouse, a journal that is often described as conservative. And in Kansas City, I visited the National Catholic Reporter, the lay-led newspaper that was celebrating its 50th anniversary that year and is often described as liberal. And at first, You might think that I would get ideological whiplash by, by being in the presence of these two organizations in a 48-hour period. It might be difficult to see what they had in common. But you could only make that mistake if you understand the city of God in strictly spatial or political terms. It would indeed be hard to see how two groups who so often disagree with one another could share the same space. But like John Paul II and John the 23rd, what the two ultimately have in common is not an idea or a platform, but a communion of hearts. The city of God is not a space, it's a communion. And this communion among the Catholic members of both of those groups is not a union of their hearts with one another as much as it is a union of their hearts with Jesus Christ, who is the sole source of our unity as a church. And some people think that talking this way, stressing our unity in Christ, minimizes real and important disagreements that we have with each other. But in fact, it is what makes disagreement possible. For a real argument requires freedom of minds and hearts. When we act out of our faith that the sole source of our unity is not the rightness or wrongness of our ideas, but our devotion to a person, then we are more free to disagree with one another, precisely because we are more free to be wrong. And our conversation then becomes an encounter rather than merely a confrontation. And while we may sound different notes, if we listen closely enough, we can hear a certain harmony. Father Davis completed his self-described pilgrimage from the city of man to the city of God in 1986. He was reading that week's letters to the editor when his heart gave out. It's unlikely that it was something he read that killed him. It wasn't someone else's opinion that killed him. It was simply his time to go home. And Father Davis's heart was always fixed there, on his true home. And that alone made him one of the freest and fiercest intellectuals of his time. For our part, American media seeks to address the problem of the church and the political by generating content that bridges the divides created by ideological partisanship. We seek to generate content that applies the insights of the Second Vatican Council to the 21st century church, that bridges the generational divide between those who have come of age with the Council and those who have come of age with the Internet. We seek to generate content that is non-ideological, that bridges the partisan divide, that finds its dynamism and its credibility in the scandal of the gospel rather than in some self-affirming worldview. It means creating content that is postmodern, being unafraid to proclaim the final inadequacy of every meta-narrative except for Revelation. And it means generating content that builds on the work of John Courtney Murray, respecting the distinction between church and state, but also building bridges between public and private, and religious and secular. Through our media ministry, we seek, in our own modest way, to provide a form of ecclesial discourse that is informed, intelligent, and above all charitable. And in doing so, to provide a model for society at large. Thus, when people ask me, is America a philosophical or theological journal, I say, we are Christians. If they ask whether we are modern or postmodern, I say, we are Christians. And if they ask whether we are liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican, I answer, we are Christians. And if they ask whether I have really said anything at all, I say, we have said everything. In our ministry, we seek to harness the power of new media in the service of an ancient mission, the evangelization of peoples and the progress of civil society. And when that occasional cynic or skeptic also asks why Jesuits need to be on social media or why we need to evangelize through every emerging digital platform, I ask in return, Why did the early Jesuits buy a printing press? Why did St. Ignatius move them downtown? Why did he instruct them not to buy any old printing press, but the very best one that they could find? More importantly, why did St. Paul journey to Athens? And why did he climb the hill to the Acropolis? And why did he preach in the Areopagus? Because in his time, that was the place where the Christian future would be won. And in our time, that place is in your hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father, for those really inspiring and insightful comments. And I think it'll be a tough act to follow, but we do have some time for questions. So anybody in the office or in the audience, trust me, nobody's in the office. Please raise your hands and yes, sir.
Well, I think you're right. I think your characterization of the secular media is correct. I think the question that we should ask ourselves is, how are we a part of the problem? Because I think that we, as Catholic Christians in this country, too often characterize these documents in sound bites, and not just ones that we got from the media, but sound bites that have been generated by filtering what is being said to us through our own predetermined ideas. Not suggesting that you do this, but I have done it in my own life, and I see it happen all the time. So I think the first question is, how are we a part of the problem? And how do we stop being a part of the problem? And the answer to that is, there are as many answers to that question as there are people. But I think on a greater level, a higher level, we have to stop seeing our life as a church as a contest, as an election, right? We have to stop seeing it as a place where we have winners and losers. We are not actually a political community, but we are a communion, a sacrament, right, that transcends all earthly boundaries, right? That is fundamentally important. The most important question facing the church in this country today, and each of us as Catholic Christians, is, what is your ecclesiology? What is your vision of the church? Because the way you answer that question will in large measure determine how you answer all of the other ones.
Yes, sir.
Sure. Well, Pope Francis gave some really great advice to young Catholics when he was at World Youth Day. He said, go out and make a mess. The lovely kind of colloquialisms of Pope Francis that nourish people and panic others. But I think there's some truth to that, right? So, look, the most important thing that we can do at any age is to allow ourselves to be scandalized by the grace of God. Grace is a destabilizing force. It breaks us down before it builds us up. Things tend to get messier before they get better, right? And I think this moment, if we're really going to break out of these categories of thought and these narrow preoccupations, we're going to have to allow something to happen to us, right? Because it's only in that way are we then able to give an account of the joy that is within us. And Von Balthasar was right. Love alone is credible. Joy alone is credible. That's why Pope Francis's encyclical is called The Joy of the Gospel, right? Because it's only when we give an account of the joy that is within us that we are able to talk heart to heart instead of head to head. So my advice is to live your own faith as deeply as you can, and to allow the grace of God to transform your heart in unexpected ways, so that you can speak with credibility to the hearts of others.
Time for one more. Dennis?
Thanks for coming to Cleveland, Father.
Sure.
Right now, I have it in my hand. Pope Francis has about 9 million followers on Twitter. I'm curious, in light of what you said, 9.32 million followers, exact.
Probably 9.4 in just the time we've been talking.
I'm curious to ask you how you see getting through that clutter. Lady Gaga has about 9 times that amount, 7 times that amount. Others have so much more. But that's only one medium. That's not doing very well. May not exist in a year from now. In light of the clutter that is now our social media, how do you get that a dialogue going, and then how do you break through that clutter? Particularly from your post in New York City, which is important.
Yeah. That's a great question. I might have given you the impression that I'm a pessimistic person. But if I did, I didn't intend to, because I'm not. I'm actually quite hopeful. And I really believe, I'm charged with believing this as the editor-in-chief of a weekly magazine, but I really also believe this as a matter of personal conviction, that if you say something that is intelligent and that is charitable, right, and that advances a conversation, you will be heard. Right? You will be heard. And I mean, the impact of it may be immeasurable in the near term, but I really believe that there are people out there, I think there's probably a lot of them in this room, who are hungry, who want to be, yes, affirmed, but also challenged and nourished. And I always say to the editorial staff at America, every issue of America should have something in it that affirms the reader, that challenges the reader, and that nourishes the reader. And I think if you are able to do those three things, then your voice will be heard. Not least because it will be different than the other voices that are speaking. At a practical level, our strategy is to really be very careful about how we use social media and how we use it to bring people together, because just as often it's used to drive people apart, right? But we want to be a place where people can point to and say, that's a good example of how to use this for good, right? It's not easy, and we make mistakes along the way. And we get just as excited as everybody else does. And you know, the Twitter sphere is it's a pretty bloody battleground. And you know, and we're all human. But I think in the end, fundamentally, if you remain true to yourself, as we are attempting to do in America, and you sincerely endeavor to say something that affirms and challenges and nourishes, that's smart, and that advances the conversation, you will be heard. I have that conviction. I have a great deal of faith in the common sense and the good judgment of people, even and perhaps especially when they make mistakes. Thanks.
Thank you, Father.
I'd also like to thank Father Jeremy Zippel for live streaming this talk and for arranging. You know, he's the head of our film division, and he's doing amazing work for us. And I'd like to thank the rest of my staff from America who did so much of the preparation, worked with the Loyola Club, and made sure you got this confirmation photo of me to put on the, the front of the program.
Well, Father, as a small token of our appreciation and a memento, we hope, of your first and I hope many more visits to Cleveland, Ohio, here is a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame guitar. I guess in light of your remarks, maybe I should have picked something other than black and white, but here it is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm not usually known for being cool, so this is really cool. Thank you.
Don't worry, me neither. And just a couple housekeeping remarks. First, remember if you parked with valet, get the voucher on your way out. Secondly, remember we're reconvening in October. Hope to see you then. And then thirdly, for our concluding prayer, Olivia Arbogast, who is a graduate of the class of 2009 from Walsh Jesuit, and also in keeping with our theme, the digital media coordinator at St. Joseph's Academy, will do our concluding prayer. Olivia?
Hi, everybody. Let us pray. Holy Spirit of love, it is you who connects us to one another. You are everywhere, in the depths of our hearts, in the world, and in the creatures around us. May this awareness draw us to focus on the issues rather than the individuals espousing them, to seek the source of disagreement as well as the points of common purpose, to embody open-mindedness and a willingness to let you change your hearts, and to treat others with respect, especially those who differ from us. When in the midst of noise we sometimes fail to hear your voice, we beg for your mercy. Heal what needs to be healed so we may be more deeply connected to one another and to you. Amen.
Thank you, Olivia. That concludes our program. Go Cavs.